Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the broadcast this evening. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Moderator.
How are you this evening, sir?
Oh, fine, fine. When
Yeah.
when you start feeling like brandy every hour, you don't know whether it's the weather or old age that's making the call. But I'm fine, thank you.
Yeah, I'd make it a diplomatic response this evening. I won't go
Oh.
with the old age. I'll go with the weather. So I would not be
Thank you.
accused of saying something.
Thank you.
I will go
Chairman.
with the weather this evening, sir. um, Sir, this evening, I wanted to take you in a particular direction, which I would introduce in a minute. But before we do that, I'll go back to some of the developments we've seen. I'm sure that our viewers would want to hear your views and also be part of a discussion around what Africa should do or could do to take advantage of the anti-West sentiments that we're having to maybe, in a sense, get Francophone Africa out of the grip of the French government and all the challenges that have been there. And we could broaden that a little bit and not just focus on Francophone Africa, but Africa in general. But before we look at that topic, um, Niger has been, we've seen quite a few somewhat confusing in some of the messaging that's been coming out regarding ECOWAS, regarding Niger. Has your position changed, sir, from last week in terms of the new developments you have seen in Niger so far?
Well, I'm not even aware that I had a position. When you have the fluctuating changes in a developing political situation, and especially one within the foreign policy field, you can't have a fixed position. And secondly, the two issues you raised are linked. Developments in Niger, issues affecting the Francophonies and French situation in Africa, and developments within Niger itself. Niger, like Ukraine, have becoming recurrent decimals within global affairs that every week we need to talk about it. So I'm not going to run away from the situation. So let us talk about the elephant in the room, which is the communique issued at the end of the ECOWAS summit in Abuja. Communique issued about an hour ago. And the ECOWAS, the communique talked about the setting up of a standby force by ECOWAS to address the situation in Niger. And one knows the issue is going to arise. What does the standby force mean? What's the difference between a standby force and an ECOWAS army? And Does this mean we're on the verge of war? So let's address that issue. And as you rightly said, Mr. Moderator, I'm challenging my compatriots on the platform to please join in the dialogue or in the conversation. Let's really make it a conversation. And if there is a reluctance to stick out your neck, if you want me alone to stick out my neck, you may force me to say some outrageous things in order to provoke you into putting in your voice into the conversation. So let's start with the community. Does the setting up of a standby force mean we are ready to go to war? And my answer, as the answer I gave last week when we were talking about the use of force, the possibility of the use of force, is no. It does not mean that next week we are going to war or next month we are going to war. I will ask, I will put it in the form of a question. Does having an army means you are ready to go to war? Does it? There are countries that have had armies for 50 years, 100 years, who have never gone to war. But you set up an army just in case. It's not when the situation arises that you now start recruitment, go to secondary schools and pull out, people's children and put them in uniform. And they start, singing. I remember when I was a soldier, even if they've never been a Boy Scout. So having a standby force does not mean you are going to war next week. It simply means, like the Boy Scout logo or Boy Scout motto, be prepared. You are going to be foolish if in the middle of a crisis, you still have a laid back position. And you are letting the other side know that you are serious about the objective, not the means. You are serious about the objective. The means still remain fluid. So that's really my own interpretation. So I'm not going to ask for Nigerians with passports to dust off their passports and start booking flights and heading for the airport in order to avoid war. So that's my own interpretation of the communique that had come out of Abuja in the last 1 hour or so. In what way will the communique affect the crisis? Because it is a crisis that ECOWAS faces. And my own answer will be that the communique shows the seriousness of the situation. And I think that the presence in Abuja of, I believe, 2 heads of states who are not members of ECOWAS, Burundi, and there is another president from East Africa, I believe, who attended the summit, showed that it is even now perceived as an African crisis and not just a West African crisis. And in fact, that probably sounds rather simplistic of me. From day one, it's been evident that it is a world crisis because all the world superpowers either been involved or shown interest, overtly or covertly. So it had never been a local crisis. It had never been a regional crisis. And I think we should be paying very serious attention to the development. And the reaction from the Nigerian side shows a determination that they also regard it as a serious crisis. You don't, usually in a situation like this, you don't make too many enemies for yourself. Whether it is ECOWAS or the EU or the United Nations or the United States or France. Usually in a situation like this, you even look for, what do you lose, I will ask, by talking? What would you lose? But when you turn down all avenues for dialogue, except those that you handpick for religious reasons to dialogue with, I think there's a misreading of the situation. If I were advising the Nigerian government from day one, I would have advised them, talk to anybody who comes to talk to you. You don't lose anything. And if you think that, they are wasting your time, they're also wasting their own time. But don't antagonize people in this, especially when you are playing the weaker hand. Don't antagonize people. Not asking you to give up your position or give up your objectives, but there are ways and means in which you can let people know how serious you are about your own position without necessarily antagonizing them. They will perceive this communique from Abuja as part of the who is going to blink first syndrome. So it's like a chess game. ECOWAS has now moved his bishop while still protecting its queen. On your side, if that is it, how do you counter the move by the bishop without exposing your own queen? There are still several steps in that chess game before they capture your kingdom. Several steps. The fact that they've moved to their bishop does not mean that the game is over. So there's no need for panic, whether from the ECOWAS side or from the side of Niger. But I think that the statement purportedly made by the Senegalese president, I think is very important, which is that the coup in Niger is one coup too far. Or was it the Ivorian president who made it? I don't know. One of the presidents from the Francophonies said the coup in Niger was a coup too far. The linkage, and I hope I am not violating the guidelines you laid down, that this is not supposed to be a monologue, that we're inviting our compatriots on the platform to contribute. This last point I'm going to make is the linkage the linkage between this and the position of neocolonialism in Africa simply illustrates what scholars in international affairs have always known, which is that a crisis does not present you with a one goal issue, because it's a not one factor issue, a crisis, especially one that has several components. And in this particular case of Niger, it presents the complexity. Number one, all of us, and that includes our leaders, have to be against neo-colonialism. All of us have to be against neo-colonialism. All of us have to recognize and deprecate the post-colonial policies of the French in Africa. We have to deprecate it right from the word go. And thirdly, we now have to deprecate existence of coups, even when the coup is directed at one of those responsible for the chaos that you have in the sub-region. Now, how do you now reconcile this? How do you? If you are against France neocolonialism, does it mean you have to be in favor of the coup? And if you are against the coup, does it mean you are in favor of French neocolonialism? It's oxymoronic. And so, for policy planners, how do you now balance what looks now like contradictions in the objectives of immediate policies, of short-term goals? So again, let me repeat, objectives of policy, we all have to be against neo-colonialism. We must be. And we must support forces directed at driving out of Africa neo-colonial forces. We must be. But at the same time, we must be against coups directed at democratically elected governments. So those will be my very long-winded introductory remarks. Well, again, I join you in asking our colleagues to please join.
Absolutely, sir. We will ask them to join, but before we deal with neo-colonialism, there are 2 points about Niger that I want to get your views on, and then we'll move on to that. Number one is, when the coup took place, there were 2 principal characters that we were looking at. It was the military Nigerian team and ECOWAS. Now we're hearing that a local rebel leader is now building a coalition against the coup plotters. And I think that is significant, because now we're starting to see internal resistance within Niger. So the question there is, now that we seem to be having internal resistance, to what extent does that start to weaken the position of the coup plotters? And to what extent does that strengthen the position for ECOWAS? So that's the first point. The second question, sir, is that now the EU is saying that they are starting planning of sanctions against Niger. But that meeting is not going to take place until the 31st of August or somewhere in that region. Are they signaling that they expect this impasse to continue up till the end of August? So those are my two questions to you, sir, and then we start to deal with the other one.
When you are handling a crisis, believe me, 2 weeks, you would think you've just blinked and 2 weeks had come on board. 2 weeks is a very short period when you are handling a crisis, whether domestic or foreign. The issue you've raised about the resurgence or the resurrection of a jihadist leader within Niger simply shows you the danger to not only Niger, but also the danger to us. ECOWAS should not regard a weakening of the copists as something it should embrace. Why do I say so? Look at what's happened in Libya, where some of the forces engineered, some of the anti-Gaddafi forces engineered by France, by NATO, by the United States, haven't used them to get rid of Gaddafi. They have lost control over them. And what you've had is instability in Libya up until today. Now you could say, well, that's Libya's business. Well, what's the connection between that and the issue? Part of the destabilization of the Sahel had been a consequence of the overthrow of Gaddafi. Part of the reason why there has been, the news in the past 48 hours has been, discovery of graves of women and children, of Africans, graves of Africans in the desert. The people going to Libya, to Tunisia, in order to get onto the boat to Europe. Had been part of that been the consequence of the overthrow of Gaddafi. The increasing, the Mediterranean Sea had become a graveyard for Africans. Gaddafi warned Europe that he was the one standing in between illegal immigrants flooding Europe and staying in Africa. And that if they got rid of him, they will regret it because the gates will become wide open for these illegal immigrants. Well, it's not only Europe that is paying the price, the rise of Arab racism against Africans is the price we are paying. The flood of illegal immigrants from below the Sahara Desert flooding into Europe with graveyard in the Sahara Desert. That's the price we are paying. And what is going to happen is if you now have a destabilization, loss of internal control by the central government in even ECOWAS will pay the price because there will now be an influx of refugees, both going north and coming south. And we are the one who shares the longest boundary with Niger. So we will also pay the price because then you're going to have the influx. And the refugees who will be flocking across that frontier are not likely to just be peaceful refugees. They are, I mean, you may also have some of these jihadists, some of the revolutionaries, armed, by the way, coming across into West Africa. And and yet those who have created the problem at that point will wash their hands and go back to Europe. After all, they've already withdrawn their citizens from Niger. So really, it's a no-win situation for everybody, a no-win situation. I know what you mean by your question. Yes, ECOWAS would have captured Niamey and driven the central government or the central forces out of Niamey. But as they found out in Libya, the fact that you've driven people out of Tripoli, that doesn't mean you've captured the whole country. And I don't think that even ECOWAS have enough forces to capture every inch. I mean, those are desert fighters. They don't care. They don't worry. It just means, more fighting, more for them.
The second question, sir, the one regarding sanctions from the European Union. What do you think about the response of the European Union to the coup in Niger compared to the response to Mali and Burkina Faso? Is there something more strategic about Niger that maybe we had ignored in the past, and now Niger is turning out to be more important to the EU than Burkina Faso was, than Mali was? Would like to hear your take on that, sir.
Well, obviously, the assessment of the coup in Niger and the danger that coup poses to several regional organizations, including the EU. Not only are they complex, but they are different from the evaluation of Mali and Burkina Faso. I think, as I made reference in my introductory remarks to what the president of either Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire made, that the coup in Niger is just one coup too far. And if you allow it to go, who knows? It's not going to stop there. Which other country in ECOWAS is going to be the next target for coupists? It will simply, it's already spreading like a rash. And you simply, if you've got a family of 5 and 2 are down with rashes, you are going to start paying more serious attention to ensure that, the remaining 3 don't catch that rash. Before me, you may have thought, oh, maybe this is just heat rash. But by the time the second child gets it, you start thinking, could this be measles? And then you don't want it to become smallpox by the time it gets to the 3rd child. And I think this is what we are seeing, that even for the EU, France got kicked out of Mali, it got kicked out of Burkina Faso. And the stabilizing forces, they got replaced by Wagner, which we will have to see an extension of Russian power into that area. But when you now start having the possibility of Wagner moving into Niger and kicking, not only the French, but the American from the military bases that are there. I'm not saying, don't misunderstand me, because people make a mistake to think you're explaining something is a justification for that thing. I would love to see an Africa without military bases, without the presence of foreign forces, whether those foreign forces are American or French or German or Russian or Chinese. I would like to see Africa free of all those kinds of foreign forces. But all I'm saying is, in answer to your question, the possibility of the extension of Russian power into Niger through the expulsion of French and the Americans from their bases may simply be a development that the EU is not going to be prepared to countenance, even though it countenanced the extension of the Wagner troops into Mali and Burkina Faso. Again, they may simply think Niger is one extension for Wagner, an extension too far.
Thank you, sir. Let me now open the floor to contributions from people. Please do raise your hand, but bear in mind that with the number of people on the call, I may not be able to see you physically raising up your hand, but just use raise your hand option. Once the team see that, they will bring it to my attention, and I will call you. There's a comment here, sir. Thank you for this, and thank you for inviting us. My question is this: how is it possible to resist neo-colonial domination and exploitation in a peaceful and democratic way in the glaring face of leadership lethargy, action, and equity in the development of their own people and land?
A very good question. A very, very good question. I think that it's easy for me to sit here and postulate the fact that a democratically elected government should be prepared to take such actions to rid its country of neo-colonialist forces. I'm not ruling over a country. There's no danger to my life or to my position. But when we look at the history of Africa and the way, and that's why I said much earlier that the behavior of France in its territories has been appalling. Let us stretch that by one equation. The behavior of France towards Nigeria during our civil war, and even since then, has been appalling. France has never been comfortable with the size of Nigeria, and anything that will break Nigeria into smaller units has been French policy towards us. And this is well known again by scholars. But if you are sitting in a French-speaking African country, and you know that the French Legion and the French paratroopers are just one telephone call away from invading your country and overthrowing you and assassinating you because you are taking pressure to insulate your country from French colonial policies. You will think twice about doing so. And this is not just a theoretical analysis on my part. Even when you think there is no linkage, the last exercise of French colonial activity in Africa, in West Africa, was the quote unquote coup that brought Ouattara into office in the Côte d'Ivoire when the president there, who was had taken a decision to allow a German construction company to be awarded the contract to build a bridge in Côte d'Ivoire. And France said that contract should have been given to a French company. And, the president said, but what the price the French company was quoting was so excessively outrageous that he couldn't simply do so. Oh boy, he had violated one of the articles of the agreement that France forced all its former colonies to sign, that every contract awarded a French company must have the first option. And that is what led to that civil war in Côte d'Ivoire, that the French forces invaded the presidential palace, arrested the sitting president, took him to the ICC on the grounds of violation of human rights, installed Ouattara, who was prepared to do their bidding, and it was the independence of the court, the ICC, that finally freed, after about 5 years, freed the former president and declared him not guilty. But by that time, the French forces had taken him out. People are aware of that if you're a sitting president. And we are talking about something that happened, what, I don't know, 16 years ago or so. I think Jonathan was in power, or Obasanjo, I don't know. One of them was in power, So I'm not talking about something from ancient times. What you want to know is sitting president. In other words, the message you are then sending to younger officers in the army who are aware of this is that the only way to kick the French out is to mount a coup against your own president. Not because you think he's incompetent, but simply because you think he will not have the nerve, to pursue nationalistic policies. But then there's also a danger there. Thomas Sankara was a leader, and I was foreign minister when he was president, but I related with him very, very closely. And yet he got overthrown by his number two, who was his closest friend, since both of them joined the army. That one overthrew him and got him assassinated, engineered by the French. So it's just now that we are starting to see, because of the presence of Wagner, that the French are now knowing they cannot get away with mounting military actions against successful coups.
Thank you, sir. There's another question here. This person says, or comment, I should say, diplomacy is a thin rope in many cases. With ECOWAS and Niger, there is no telling how that is going to pan out, primarily because Niger is doing what Burkina Faso and Mali were slow to do, which is consolidating power. Now that ECOWAS has decided to intervene, one can't help but wonder what plans Nigeria has as the chair of ECOWAS for the fallout, i.e. refugees, food, pharmaceuticals, water, etc. Is Nigeria ready for that?
I think that's a question that all of us will have to pose to President Tinubu if he ever holds a press conference, or his foreign minister whenever whenever he is appointed and given a portfolio. I think that the Senate, Nigerian Senate, missed an opportunity by not asking that kind of question during the confirmation hearings of the ministerial nominees. At least, but then again, maybe I shouldn't blame them, because maybe they didn't see anybody with the potential of the foreign affairs portfolio to ask that kind of question. But so I don't know. I don't know our preparedness.
There's another question here that says the call for a standby force should have made more sense during peacetime. An ECOWAS force without 4 countries is not the best. Also, sir, going ahead, will this put much weight on Nigeria financially, which we cannot afford? In the case of ECOMOG, there was war already, and it was a response to the humanitarian crisis that led to the intervention.
Let me repeat the question to make sure I understand it. It said a standby force. Something like doesn't make sense without the participation by 4 countries.
A standby force would have made sense during peacetime. I think this person is questioning the fact that this standby force is only being created now, that it should have been created before we got to a situation that we have with Niger at the moment. The second point in here is that this standby force is not made up from all members of ECOWAS, is the second point I think this person is making here, sir.
Well, yes, some may, okay, some may say, well, we haven't got enough forces, but we will contribute money. Frankly, I don't see each one of the ECOWAS countries contributing troops. I think that, by the time Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, there are about Ghana, by the time those have contributed the troops, you could have others saying they will contribute police for peacekeeping operations after areas have been occupied by the military. So the military could concentrate on this and that. Others say, well, we will contribute to the financial outlay for the forces. So, I mean, those are details which I'm sure they will work out among themselves. As regards when you set up a standby force, yes, you have a point that a standby force may be more You see, a standby force may be more ready to be deployed with immediate effect, to use the military term, if it's already on the ground. But at the same time, actually, you set up a standby force. The constitution of a standby force is relevant, is related to your assessment of the threat that you will be confronting. But to set up a standby force, theoretically, you may run the risk that when an issue then arises, the standby force you have set up may not be relevant to may not be relevant to the crisis that you are facing, and that is why usually, even in peacetime, the army set up by a country usually has different, a marine section, because it could be in a maritime area, like the 3rd Marine Commandos that we had. We then got disbanded after the Civil War. You could be what now? What do you call this? The paratroop division. If you are thinking of where they will be deployed, will be like in the Sahel. You can't set up a paratroop. You can't deploy a paratroop division if it is in a forest area. They will be left hanging from branches of trees, etc., etc. So, better late than never. But to me, it wouldn't make sense to deploy troops when they are not ready, when you haven't made the correct assessment of the task that they will face.
Thank you, sir. There is another point being made here, which I think you have addressed somewhat, but I would read it out. This is from someone, Deji Hastrop, I think is what I can see here. And this person is saying, throwing out the French for their bad behavior and allowing the Wagner Group, with its record of plundering in Sudan, is a dangerous road to travel. Many have expressed objection to military intervention. I too am not sure that military intervention is the next best thing. What I have not heard are recommendations of alternatives to force the hands of the Nigerian coup leaders. Or is ECOWAS supposed to simply throw up its hands and allow every army with ambition to overthrow democratically elected countries as they wish?
I agree with Deji that Wagner is not an alternative to French or German or whichever other. As I said earlier, in some of my remarks, I wish Africa would be rid of everybody. But if I'm to have a choice between a mercenary force and an organized military force that is a state actor, I will prefer a military force that is a state actor, because behavior of a state actor is easier to control than the behavior of a mercenary actor. As we've seen, the behavior of the Wagner in Russia, it could turn on its owner. It could rebel, and then who's going to control it? So I agree with Deji on that. And I read through his question about what do you expect ECOWAS to do? Fold its hands and allow for a plethora of military coups in West Africa and do nothing. So I would say, asking our colleagues on the platform, including Deji, to throw out options on this issue is really what this is. I'm starting to suspect that these questions are designed to tie me down, so that I'm the only one talking while my colleagues, are quiet. Government, you probably would think government has all the answers all the time. It's not true. It's not true. Government even welcomes public opinion. Of course, one of the things that has upset me considerably during this crisis is how everybody is now a foreign policy expert in Nigeria. The taxi driver, the kekema driver, everybody is, and they come, and they, of course, they are given the platform to come on the television. You have to postulate their views, even when they don't know, when they have nothing to talk about. Experts on constitutional law, all of a sudden become experts on international law. And those of us who are experts in international law can easily pick the weakness in their arguments, which the moderators or the programs will not pick. But the crisis in Niger has now allowed everybody to dust off their suits and come on television to tell Nigerians what the government should not be doing. So if you experts keep quiet, you are simply creating a vacuum for everybody, the water seller, the Google seller, the market woman to come. Of course, you could argue that their lives will be affected by the crisis, but then that does not mean that they have the expertise to come up with options. It's your job, our job as experts to come up with these options.
Thank you, sir. So I throw the challenge out to everyone on the call. If you've got a comment you want to make here, raise your hand if you want to talk to the point. Again, as soon as I see your hand raised, I will bring you on the program. But sir, going back to the point around getting that whole neo-colonialist mindset and approach out of Africa. One question that keeps bugging me is, Clem, I can see your hand. I'll come to you in a minute. One question that keeps bugging me, sir, is when we look at the level of foreign direct investment that's coming into Africa, it is huge. And how do we separate getting the foreign direct investment without necessarily being under the control of these governments to do the bidding of the governments? How do we balance those two things, sir?
I don't know. I don't know. All I know is that investments, whether foreign or domestic, go where they can make profits. And at times, humongous profits. They are not going to come and do you a favor. They are not going to come to develop your land or your country if they are not going to make profit. What we should be looking out for is how to protect, how we, the people can protect our government from, from the kind of pressures that these embassies, on behalf of their foreign investors, will be putting on your government. If you read, I think about a year ago on this platform, we talked about the economic, oh, I can't think now of that title, whether it's economic assassins or economic something, by Perkins. That's a book which showed how the embassies and the foreign businessmen act hand in hand. And when you don't succumb to what the foreign businessman wants you to do, he runs to his embassy, and the embassy now, tries the diplomatic route. If that doesn't work, then they call in the economic assassins from CIA to do the job for them. So in a way, foreign businessmen and foreign embassies work hand in hand to destabilize your government if you don't do their bidding. What we should be coming up with is how to strengthen the protection around our government. Of course, it means we must assess that our governments are working in our interests. They are not we've dropped something into your account for you to enjoy your holidays, kind of senators. They are not going to be the type who will want to line their pockets rather than work in your interest. People will be more inclined to show loyalty to good governance. And this is where, again, we've shied away from a frontal discussion of whether democracy works for development. If the Europeans could have overthrown the Russian or the Chinese government when they embarked on their road to development, believe me, they would have. And under Yeltsin, when Russia was introduced to democracy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you saw what happened. The mafia, the economic businessmen, not only stole the Commonwealth, but they were now open to themselves to being used by foreign intelligence agencies to destabilize Russia until Putin came in and said, I'm having none of that. That's when Putin became a bad boy. I'm having none of that. Nobody has interrogated the behavior of the private sector under Yeltsin when they thought that they were practicing democracy. They can't try it in China because China is a one-party government, and there are no pockets for you to exploit in order to overthrow the government of China. But I said that's a debate for another day. But I can see two hands up.
Yes, sir. I am going now to Clem Baye. Clem Baye, can you please ask your question? Please unmute yourself. Clem Baye.
Okay, thank you very much. It was taking a while for me to be able to unmute myself. Thank you, Professor Akinyemi, for this program. Unfortunately, I only got to know about it last week. So, but anyway, better late than never. My concern, Prof, is that for democracy to thrive, it has to have deep roots There's so much alienation between the civilian leaderships or leadership practically all over Africa. Therefore, when somebody comes and says, this government, I'm going to remove this particular head of state, you see that people actually come out rejoicing because the depth of democracy is nothing to write home about. I was just watching on Joy News when somebody in Ghana, possibly a senior public figure, said the president of Ghana must dare not get involved in what he called useless ECOWAS. Now, if that is the thinking of a lot of people, because ECOWAS and all these regional groupings, in my view, have not really touched the common man, then what is it for the common man to gain when they say ECOWAS wants to do this? And I'd like to add the fact that the ECOWAS court, for instance, they pass rulings, they pass judgment. I know Nigeria has not been, obeying those judgments. I know other West African countries possibly behave like Nigeria. So it will now be the question that, what's the relevance of this ECOWAS? And how is it going to motivate the people, the citizenry, to be emotionally and psychologically involved in a war that is meant to restore democracy? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Claire. It's been a long time. I'm happy to hear your voice again. Let me start with one correction, which I know you will welcome. I know of a head of state in West Africa who was overthrown, actually assassinated, and the people came out onto the streets in anger, and that was Murtala Mohammed. And this was the perception of trade unionists, student unions, that he was doing the right thing for the people. I'm also aware from books which I have now read that actually Ghanaians came out against the coup that overthrew Nkrumah, and that a lot of Ghanaians were actually mowed down by the troops of Kotoka, Afrifa, and Co. And to me, to me, this is evidence that while rent-a-crowd people will usually come out to welcome coups, there have been a few instances which would then support the principle that when people see governments who are acting in their interests, they probably will be prepared to risk all to defend that government. But at the same time, the same examples that I have given also now illustrate the fact that there's no protection for governments acting in the interest of the people. Look at what has just happened to Gaddafi, and look at what happens to Thomas Sankara. I mean, these are my heroes because I know they were fighting for the interests of their country. There was no tax in Liberia. A young couple, a new young couple, would be given, certificate to possess a house as a wedding gift from the state. Nobody was paying for electricity because all of these things, but then the state could afford to give free of charge, while in other African countries, heads of states were pocketing money from petrol if they were not stealing it outright or allocating, crude oil wells to themselves. So I'm waiting for models to come out from scholars and from academics about autochthonous models, models that are indigenous to us, rather than these imported democratic governments, which are not really democratic, and they are not embolisms of good governance that we inherit, that we inherited from the departing colonial authorities, and they left behind instruments to protect them, which are protecting their interests rather than advancing and protecting our own interests. We need, all right, I mean, there's something that can happen to me, I'm ensconced in my house. We need benevolent dictators in Africa. Benevolent dictators in Africa. Because when you even get a good chap, he has only 8 years, and after the 8 years, a new government comes in that has no commitment to the policies of the previous government. Look at the Murtala Obasanjo government, although it was only there for 3 years. And I did tell General Danjuma, I said, this doesn't make sense. You are planting policies, and after 3 years, you are going to go away. These policies will not even have had time to germinate. What do you think is going to happen? He said, look, we were committed to serving only 3 years, and Murtala has told the country that's all we will do, and that's what we will do. And you saw what happened. Shagari came in and started releasing import licenses that killed the nascent industries that people had invested money in because they believed in the policies of the previous regime. This will not happen, I suppose, in the United Kingdom, because the civil servants are there to ensure that we don't overturn policies overnight. Here, we had a stronger civil service under the military than we do now. The civilian governors treat the civil service as an appendage of themselves, not even of the party. That's what has happened. So who protects the interests of the people? Who protects good policies? And that's why we are running regimes of abandoned properties, because each governor wants to award new contract so he can take his own cut. I hope I've addressed the issues you've raised. I have no answers. It's very good for me to say what we need to have. How do we get there? I think that has been the problem with scholarship in Africa. How do we get there if we continue to use the systems and analysis that we inherited from the West?
Thank you, sir. There's a question I can see here from Ambassador Igali. Good evening, sir. And he says, now that ECOWAS has taken the gauntlet to insist on activating military troops, referring to the standby force, should diplomacy not eventually yield early results and there is rightly regional enforcement action under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter? Are we likely to have Chinese and Russian support should the matter come up on the floor of the Security Council?
Ambassador Igali, you and I ought to sit down over lunch, paid for by you, by the way. Good wine, good wine. I must insist on that. And talk about this. Your experience in the field is just as vast as mine. If ECOWAS and the AU take a solid position, I would like to think that the Chinese and the Russians will not run the risk of vetoing a united position by the African Union and ECOWAS. But if we are divided, then they can wiggle their way through and either abstain from voting or actually outright veto. So the ball is back in the court of the AU and back in the court of ECOWAS. I welcomed the presence of non-ECOWAS head of state at this conference. I welcome the presence of representatives of the United Nations. I hope that part of the outcome of this conference will actually be that the ECOWAS should not limit its diplomatic outreach to just the Nigerian government alone. I expect now to see diplomatic missions being sent out to Russia, being sent out to China, being sent out to even the United States to say this is the position of Africa and we need your support. What irritates me is what I would call the conspiracy school, even in Africa, who think that when there is a convergence of interests between, say, the United States and Africa, it must mean Africa doing the bidding of the United States and not the other way around. I think I'm so confident about the intellectual capability of we Africans to think that we are not necessarily houseboys to the West or Russian or Chinese diplomats, that we cannot stand our own ground. So I will hope that the ECOWAS will now expand its diplomatic outreach to non-African countries in order to sell our position. So that if the issue ever gets to the United Nations, we will have alerted the Russians and alerted the Chinese. This is our position. And we won't wait until it even gets to the Security Council before we send out sensitization missions to go there.
So one point that's quite interesting, sir, is when we look at, we try to answer the question of if we succeed in getting out the French, we succeed in getting out the West, as some people are advocating that hasn't worked in the interest of Africa. And we look back at some research. There's a particular one that we came across on the London School of Economics website, which is an article that shows that China investments in Africa, FDI in Africa, overtook the United States somewhere around 2012, 2013. So we've already been having such a huge investment from the Chinese in Africa. Should that make the Chinese the logical next partner to consider? Or how exactly should we be looking at who we want to partner with for the future if we had that opportunity?
No, I don't think it's a question of either or. I think we want to partner everybody, provided that we lay down the parameters of economic development, the parameters of their involvement in our economic activities. And in this case, I'm particularly happy at the activities of the African Exim Bank and the African Development Bank, two international or continental banks being run by exceptionally bright Africans who should be brought actually into the equation and who should now be used as instruments for foreign investment, rather than actually allowing us to deal, Nigeria Chinese, Burundi Chinese, Tanzania Chinese, Kenya Chinese, or French Democratic Republic of the Congo, and that kind of thing. Let us use these continental banks as instruments of the negotiation and instruments of the involvement. I think we will get better deals from them, and they can then actually protect us from taking wrong decisions in terms of accept the kind of conditions that we accept from foreign investors. But I don't want to see, we will be the losers if we allow ourselves to be positioned that what we take from the Americans should be regarded by the Russians or the Chinese as being anti-Chinese. What we accept from the Chinese, the Americans should regard it as being directed at them. It is our development. It is our continent we are talking about. It is our own economic resources we are talking about. And it is the best that we should be expecting. But we have to play the diplomatic game very astutely, that we don't allow ourselves to be boxed into a corner. Now, let me say something very controversial. People know me, I'm always controversial. So let me say something very controversial. The immediate objective of ECOWAS in Niger is a restoration of democracy. If the Americans and the French will assist ECOWAS to restore democracy, I will accept their assistance, provided provided the French will know that it's not going to be business as usual with their neo-colonial policies. That we are not restoring democracy just to allow the French government to continue to do what it does there. I think that, and we can do that. We can leverage on French economic presence in several of our countries to say, don't think because you are going to help us to restore democracy, you can continue what you are doing there. We will not accept it. If that condition is acceptable to the French, I will accept that. But if for the fear that people will say we are French agents or we are American agents, therefore, we will not accept any assistance from them for ECOWAS to achieve its objective of restoration of democracy, then I think we are being childish in our foreign policy.
All right, sir. I have one big challenge tonight, and I am already 23 minutes over.
Wow. No.
And
we've got to let our people go.
Yes, sir. That's what I wanted to say. Ambassador Egali, I've seen your question. I will bring that back next week, sir. Apologies, but I will bring that back next week. 8:23 is way beyond that time. I do apologize to everyone. I was enjoying the conversation, even though the time was right in front of me. I was enjoying that conversation. We've got to close tonight. Thank you all very much for your time. Thank you very much, sir. We'll be back same time next week. Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night.
Akan.